Hello, my name is Anthony Luscre. I am retired from Spark. I'm going to be presenting today on STEAM activities across the curriculum using radio technology. This session will be recorded for pre-recorded for your viewing. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen here. I've also given this presentation with the title Radio Technology in the Classroom and Education, and you can contact me at K8ZT at ARRL.net. You can visit my websites, and I'll give you more contact information at the end of the presentation today. This is the shortened version of the full presentation. For the full presentation, go to tiny.cc/RTICE. That's RTICE. That'll give you access to all the slides. Most of the slides have links that you can click on them for more resources. So radio, why would I include that in my classroom? Everyone knows that no one uses radio anymore. Radio is that thing that sat on your great-grandparents' mantle, was carried in the pocket of a 1950s or 60s teenager, was in that Ford car, and had the brand new FM band on this newer radio, or was that bright pink clock radio on your mother's bedside table. In the 80s and 90s, we had boom boxes and the Sony Walkman and other types of radios available. But again, they're all radios and no one uses those anymore. Everyone's using these things, but they don't realize they're all radios. These actually have multiple radios in each one. Every cell phone actually is a very high frequency or ultra high frequency radio. If you're using tablets and you're connected to various resources on the internet, again, you're using radio. Most people listen to a lot of their music on what they don't think are radios, but still radio technology is being used in the background. And everyone talks about Wi-Fi, but they don't call it radio, but it is radio frequency. With your tablets, your laptops, your Chromebooks, etc., you're using radio frequency communication to be able to connect to the internet, to be able to send something to your printer, to be able to send an email. And when you pull in your driveway and you use that key fob to either open your car or to open the garage door, again, we're using radio technology. Bluetooth is something that a lot of people talk about, yet another radio technology. Bluetooth is a short distance radio technology that's used to connect things like mice or speakers or headphones to your computing device. Now, sometimes we have radio signals coming from very far away and we need to use very special antennas, but again, they are radio. These soldiers have approximately 8 devices on them that are radio frequency devices. And you might have seen robotics. Well, most robotics are controlled by radio control. Even self-driving cars, drones, etc. And none of this is possible without radio frequency. GPS is actually a receiver in your car that's listening to multiple satellites, and by knowing the difference in time between each of the satellites, it can calculate where you're at. The maps might be loaded on a database, but the information on to be able to tell exactly where you're at depends on radio frequencies from satellites. You can even go to the Taj Mahal and use their free Wi-Fi, again, radio. Basically, if there is no physical connection between two devices, then it's probably one of 3 things. Either radio waves, the very most likely of them 3. It could be visible or near visible light. So when you use the remote control on your TV, it might be using infrared or ultraviolet waves. But again, they're waves. Or it might be using sound waves in some rare cases. But all these ways of controlling devices or sending information between 2 devices depends on waves of different frequencies. In 2015, there was an average number of connected wireless devices per consumer of about 3.64. 2017, it passed 4 devices per person. 2021, the estimates I've seen now exceed 9 devices, resulting in about 75 billion connected devices in total in the world. So there's just so many devices out there, and they are all depending on radio. The terms used for radio over the years have changed. The term wireless was used very commonly for radio worldwide before 1920, and that's still the term that's used in quite a bit of the UK and Europe. They refer to wireless as instead of radio quite often. In US in 1990s, all of a sudden the term Wi-Fi came back again, and wireless came back again with consumer computers and phones. RF, which means radio frequency, is just a short way to abbreviate what type of energy we're using for all these operations. Bluetooth is simply a low power, short distance, extremely high frequency radio frequency. Wi-Fi, technology for wireless local area networking, sometimes known as IEEE 802.11, is a way of using radio waves to communicate our internet connections. Again, radio by any other name is still radio, whether it's television, a radio remote control, cellular, walkie or handy-talkie, satellite TV, wireless telegraphy, ground-to-air communications, shortwave, microwave, radar, car key clicker, GPS, or a satellite phone all depend on radio. The bad part is, although a large number of today's students understand computers, many know how to program. They know about the hardware of computers. Over a third of the students have worked with robotics, and over 90% use a cell phone and or tablet regularly. But almost none have worked extensively with radio technology, build a radio, a simple circuit, or even understand exactly how radio works. The good thing is, think of the advantage of a student entering college or a career that knows radio frequency technology in addition to computer technology. So there's different levels that you might choose for integrating radio into your school. And all of these blend together, and there's no right or wrong way. Simply exposure, and I do a program quite often with 5th and 6th graders where we do a one-day exploration of radio technology. That'd be an example of an exposure program. Also in that program, we do some integration into lessons, and I'll talk more about different types of lessons you can use with radio integrated into them. You might integrate it into your STEAM or STEM curriculum. You might use it in your DIY or makerspace. Sometimes you might refer interested students to an outside group that can let them grow further in radio technology and possibly even get their amateur radio license. You might have an after-school radio club. You might have classroom radio curriculum. There's a couple schools that have a full curriculum based on radio technology in the classroom, and they use it extensively. So why would you use amateur radio in the classroom? Well, it's a great gateway to high-tech jobs. Most students have software experience, but not hardware or especially RF experience. It's a great STEAM or maker movements, and we'll talk about some of the original DIYs or makers were amateur radio operators in the early 1900s. Here's an example of a 1962 classroom. Everyone's sitting in their neat rows of desks. I know I was doing this at that time. But let's take a little bit look at what happened with some of these students later on. We have Patty here. She's a retired programmer for Microsoft. Henry, he works for PricewaterhouseCoopers. Paul works for Tesla Motors. Bob is a professor of engineering at Purdue. And Roger is a retired high school chemistry teacher. And back here in the back, Sam, the always mischievous one, runs Dude's Waikiki Surf Shop. Now notice in all these, after their name, there's a couple letters. That's their amateur radio call sign. And all these kids at one point in time before they finished high school or college got involved with amateur radio, and it was a gateway into high-tech fields. Many times this was on their own. It had nothing to do with the school. Sometimes it did have something to do with the school. But again, the whole idea of an extracurricular activity involving radio. Amateur radio in the classroom meets the needs of a group of students. They're the students who might not be active in sports, traditional sports, although there is radio contesting. There's a whole presentation I did called Teach Above Your Head that talks about giving the emphasis back to the students to explore things, and radio is a great way to have them do this. You can take a look at that presentation. You can click on the link here or go to tiny.cc/TAYH, Teach Above Your Head. It's also a great lifetime learning experience, and it's a great real life learning experience where students can actually work with things that they might work with after they graduate. There's a lot of mentoring available and adult interaction. Amateur radio operators, licensed adults, can be great role models for some of these students, especially with their wide variety of high technology careers that many of them have went into over the years. Interacting with the adults provides conversational skills, whether it's on the radio or at a meeting or talking about building a radio. Again, they have to use conversation skills more aligned towards adults. And one of the funny things is adult hams or amateur radio operators will treat students as equals, providing invaluable networking opportunities. Once you get your license, you're probably on a first name basis with anyone, and age doesn't matter anymore. So I've been talking about amateur or ham radio. By the way, they're the same thing. Amateur radio is the formal name. Ham radio is an informal name. We won't worry about where the name came from, but just realize that I'll be using both of them interchangeably as we go through. So what is amateur radio? It's two-way radio communication. And that's really the key there. Most of our interaction with radio has been one way for many years, listening to the local AM radio station, the FM radio station, watching television. These are all one-way communication of radio. But with amateur radio license, you're able to transmit in addition to listening. So that allows you to carry on two-way communications with radio signals. Now, we do this sometimes in the background. For example, we're doing two-way communication with our laptops when we're on the internet, but we don't think really about it as communication because it's a passive way of doing it. This is an active way. We're choosing the frequency, choosing who we want to talk to, and actually transmitting directly to them. They use a wide variety of different frequencies, and this allows local communication, regional communication, and even worldwide communication, even communication into space. It does require a federal license. The licensing is handled by the FCC, the Federal Communications, but the license has no age limit. Free classes and materials for students to learn are available very readily. I know in our area we run at least 2 classes a year, sometimes more, and we've been doing them mostly online now, so there's no limitation for students being able to travel. But you could also do a class in your school if you really got involved in this. Who could you communicate with amateur radio? Anyone else with an amateur radio license. So you're not talking to other services. This is amateur radio to amateur radio operator. So you're not talking to the police. You're not talking back to the local AM broadcast station. This is two-way communication on a service called amateur radio. And that's one thing about the FCC. They define different radio services, commercial communication, amateur radio, fire, police, etc. Those all have separate frequency allocations and they're not mixed together. They might be talking to adults or kids. They might be talking to someone very famous or maybe someone not so famous. Local and worldwide are possible. Across town with a handheld radio is very feasible. Around the world with an HF, that's high frequency radio, it's possible to contact all 50 states and over 300 countries. Even signals into space using amateur radio satellites. Amateur radios were the third organization to put a satellite into space in December of 1961. They were, after the Russians put up Sputnik and the US put up their first satellites, the next organization to launch a satellite into space were amateur radio operators. And there's currently amateur radio satellites in orbit right now that act as a giant repeater. In other words, they take the signals that come up to them and then send them back to Earth. So 2 stations on Earth can communicate via a satellite. There's also the ability to talk to astronauts on the space station, and some amateur operators even bounce their signal off the moon. So Earth, moon to Earth bouncing. How can they communicate? Well, there's a number of different modes available, and again, in addition to the multiple frequencies, amateur radios can choose what mode of operation they want to use. Voice is one of the most common ones that we think of, but Morse code, also called CW, was one of the first and is still one of the practical means of communication. And a lot of students find Morse code very interesting because it's something that they learn that their peers and parents don't know. And it's not that hard for students to grasp Morse code very quickly. There's also data transmissions where we transmit data very similar to what we would do with a file of data on a computer. We can also send images, both still pictures and videos, and we can remotely control devices such as drones or planes, etc. But what if you don't have any equipment? Well, setting up a school radio club is a great way to provide an operating station and antenna if you really get into this. And again, you don't need to make this level of commitment to start with, at least. Portable operating opportunities are available with local radio clubs. They could be a guest at another hams station. Hams are very inviting, especially to younger newly licensed hams and letting them come to their station and operating. And for just listening, there's something out there called online SDRs. SDR stands for Software Defined Receiver. These online software defined receivers are tunable. In other words, you connect to them via the internet and then you can choose the frequency and tune into what frequency you want to listen to. They're available free remotely over the internet. You can connect to one close to you, or you can connect to one on the other side of the world. And I have a nice little starter guide here for getting involved with these that I pass out when I'm working with students, and they could use their Chromebook, or they could use a phone, or they can use a computer, and this allows them to get on the air and tune in stations on a wide variety of frequencies. And one of the nice things is it's free. It doesn't require an antenna at the house where they're using it, and you can send every student home with this free technology. It's a free high-performance multiband receiver that's available online. They can choose where they want to listen from. So what other type of activities are amateur radio operators involved in? Well, one of the big things is making friends around the world. And here's a young amateur radio operator with his HF high frequency station. He's turning his rotor here to aim it at a different point around the world. Here's his radio in front of him. And he's also got a computer where he's probably doing his logging, keeping track of all the stations he works. Chatting and making friends around the world. One of the really big things is emergency communications. The Federal Communications Commission allows amateur radio operators to operate because they are a great pool of emergency communicators in case of emergency. Amateur radio operators do contesting. That's a type of competition or radio sport. Anyone that gets involved in almost any hobby wants to compare themselves with other people operating, and they spend a couple hours or maybe a whole weekend trying to contact as many stations as possible. And there's even a special competition for school radio clubs called the School Radio Competition Week, and they do that twice a year, and it's a great opportunity for clubs of students to talk to other students. And also, amateur radio operators like to build their own equipment, so there's a lot of construction and other activities involved. Fox hunting is a great way to get involved. You don't even need to be licensed to do fox hunting. You hide a transmitter and then you use a receiver with a directional antenna to try and track it down. Amateur radio operators have their own flea markets called Hamfest where they can buy and sell equipment that they could use. And again, robotics, computer interfacing are all things that are also available. I have a number of websites available. This is my main teacher resource website, also for students, called the Web Resource Hoarder site at ztlearn.com. But I also have a special site called the Kids Radio Zone and a Teacher's Radio Zone. We'll just take a quick jump out there to the Kids Radio Zone. And on this site, there's a wide variety of links with radio and a variety of other technologies, electronics. And right here, you can see you can go to the free software-defined radios I talked about earlier. There's also a whole section on NASA and space because amateur radio operators are quite interested in space, especially with the satellites that we use. So there's information also that ties into scouting. There's a number of free comic books here that they're sort of an anime style, and I found they're great resources for reluctant readers in the 5th and 6th grade. Kids who don't want to read love these anime cartoon comic books, and the funny thing is they're usually reading at a much higher level than they're used to. So that's the website. I also have another one available for teachers, and I also have a DIY site, and they're very similar. I'll give you those links right here. So it's ZT Learn, and then you go out to the sites. Here's just some screenshots. We went there live, so we can skip over those. One of the things I do with a lot of schools in my area is I do something called Student Radio Day. And I have a handout available here that describes it. I also have a teacher's agenda and a planning implementation document you can get to. So let's take a quick look. We'll bring up the student handout here first. This is the handout. And the handout is set up with different sites they can go to, including that Kids Radio Zone I showed you earlier, how to use the software-defined radios, links to the comic books, etc. We also have the phonetic alphabet because that's one of the things we talk about. A quick little way here to do a very rudimentary decoding of Morse code. When you hear a da, you move to the left. When you hear a dit, you move to the right. And that's just a way that we can do some Morse code with students who aren't really that familiar with it. Then we have a little block diagram of how a radio works, and I can explain that using this diagram. We also have information on different radio frequencies, different spectrums, and what different sections of the radio frequency bands are used for. They're allocated so they don't interfere with each other, so things such as garage doors aren't on the same frequency as cell phones. We then have prefixes for the different types of frequency. We use the metric prefixes for almost everything that we do, and radio waves are depicted, we call 1 cycle per second is called a hertz, and the distance between one full cycle is called a wavelength. And we go through some math on this, and it's a great math lesson that we use. Also, we have a diagram of the electromagnetic spectrum, and we have the frequency allocations that you can listen to amateur operators on. When I click on the teacher resources here, you'll see that it has some lesson planning ideas, what we're going to do for the day, and it depends, where you're at. You can implement this on your own if you're close by here to me. I'd be happy to work with you, or I can work with you remotely using Zoom or Google Meet is no problem at all. I've done that also. So that's my student radio day, and I recommend that for 5th through 7th grade students. It's an expiration for a day. So we cover all the content areas using radio-inspired lessons. We give an introduction to radio, some hands-on activities, including sending Morse code, tuning receivers. We do a demonstration where I talk to other people around the world, and maybe if we get a chance, let the kids talk to someone else. And that's some of the information. Here's some of the sample lessons. I'm going to go through these pretty fast, but you can go back through this and get much more information. Math, we might do inverse proportional fractions to demonstrate how wavelength and frequency are related. As the frequency becomes higher, the wavelength gets shorter. As the frequency becomes lower, the wavelength gets longer. So these are inversely proportional, and we can show how we can use ratios and fractions to describe that. We can also use the metric prefixes as part of our lesson. For science, we could choose between a number of different things. A lot of people like to do the electromagnetic spectrum, but we could also do atmospheric layers, sunspot cycle, because the sunspot cycle very involved in propagation on HF radio. We could do satellites, orbits, and tracking. We could talk about the Doppler shift. For social studies, we talk about different types of maps. If you want to point your beam antenna towards a station, you need to know what direction, and a regular map doesn't work very well, but an azimuthal or polar projection map allows me to know exactly which way to point my antenna, and we can generate one from any point in the world to show where you would point your antenna. We also talk about different countries and cultures, governments and international regulations, and the historical relationships between different countries, commonwealths, etc. So these are all things we could do for social studies. And again, we don't need to do them all. I work with the teachers and we pick out what they want to do with their class. For language arts, sometimes we work with the phonetic alphabet and talk about how that makes things clear. We can also talk about using Q codes and abbreviations that allow non-English and English speakers all to communicate by using simple 3-letter Q codes. So for example, if I say QTH, no matter what the other person speaks, they'll know that that means location. We might also go more of the broadcast or commercial radio and talk about writing a radio drama or a script or writing advertisements. So these are all things we could do for language arts. For music, we could send Morse code with drums. We could talk about frequency and pitch, the Doppler shift. For older students, we might talk about data rates, compression, and digital audio processing. For art, we might design a QSL card. A QSL card is a postcard that different amateurs send to other stations to confirm that they've talked to each other. And we might do that as a way of bringing geography and art together into a lesson. Or we might talk about light and color as components of the electromagnetic spectrum. For world languages, we could talk about world languages. We could talk about those Q codes I talked about a little earlier, the role of world cultures in radio, and we can even listen to native speakers of languages via radio broadcast. So if you're teaching students with other languages, or you have students with English as a second language, you can use those software-defined radios to tune in and listen to speakers of any language. There's also another type of tuner we use that lets you tune in commercial stations around the world called Radio Garden, and that's a great way to listen to native speakers speaking in foreign languages. For physical education, we can take jump ropes and demonstrate physically how wavelength and frequency works. The faster we move the rope, the shorter the wavelength will become as the frequency gets higher. For tech, there's just an unlimited number of things: computers and networking, cell phone technology, data rates, compression, microprocessors, DIY activities. So After the initial activity, it's up to the teacher to decide what they want to do. That might be all we do. We might just do a once a year exposure with radio in the classroom. But if you're interested, I can help you tie it into future lessons, have other different types of demonstrations. We could also set up ongoing activities, and I have a whole list of ideas here. And if your school really gets involved, we might want to set up a radio club. I am the Ohio section. The Ohio section is part of the ARRL, which is the U.S. Organization for Amateur Radio Operators, and I'm the Ohio section manager for youth and education outreach, and I'd be happy to use that to leverage getting you help from someone in your location. So if you're not in this area, I can help you find someone in your area in Ohio or anywhere around the US or even around the world. I can track down an amateur radio operator that'd be happy to work with you and your students at your location. The ARRL, which I talked about earlier, sponsors a Teachers Institute, which is free education, including transportation, lodging, meals, materials during the summer months. They do week-long teacher institutes. They also have an online educators group where you can exchange ideas and a library of online resources. Support for the effort. What can your school ham club do for your school? Well, it's a great support of STEM and maker movements. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Maker fairs, science fairs, etc. fall right into that. It's also a great way to get business connections. I can get you lined up with an amateur radio operator who runs a business in your area, and that might be a great way to even set up for older students mentorships. I know my son was very influenced by a mentorship he did in our area when he was a senior in high school, so it's something that we might be able to help you with. I mentioned ARRL before, and I talked about each summer they offer multiple sessions of the Teacher Institute. Now let's talk about some myths about amateur radio in school. The first myth is that you must have a club. That's not the case. Again, you can choose what level you're comfortable with in your school. Other people say, well, licensing is everything. You don't need to get licensing. I like to expose students, and then naturally the students that might be interested in licensing will gravitate towards it. Other students won't. Because the other myth is everyone given the opportunity wants to be a ham. Well, of course, that's definitely a myth because hams only make up about 2% of the population. The love of radio is instantaneous. No, it has to build. Some people think you should wait until high school. No, 5th and 6th graders are the ideal age group because of their interest levels and their lack of other activities that distract. Some people think kids need very simplified content. That's not really true. Sometimes we might need to change the wording, but the content can still be at a very scientific and high level. A lot of people think Morse code is dead, but students like and enjoy learning Morse code. One of the myths is you have to have an outside antenna. Well, with these software-defined radios online, you don't even need to have an outside antenna or even have a radio. And some people say, well, everything's surface mount now. No one ever builds things. Well, amateur radio operators still build electronic projects. So what can amateur radio add to your school? It's a great place to experiment with individual student interests. So it gives students who might have technology and other interests a chance to explore deeper on their own. It can be collaborative solutions to problems. It can be a place where students feel like they belong, an environment where everyone wins. It can mean a growth in verbal communication skill, geographical awareness, global context to things, and even provide leadership, and it can integrate well with a wide variety of curriculum. I have a brochure, and you can click on this link to get a copy of it, and you can print it out for yourself. It is a brochure called Ham Radio, the original makers movement, and hams really were building things with wood and different components back in the early 20s, because if you wanted to listen to radios, you couldn't just go to the store and buy one in the very beginning of radio, so you had to build your own. So there's a lot of DIY aspect to amateur radio. Amateur radio operators have been building and tinkering for over 100 years. They work with a wide variety of materials, and they use a wide variety of skills and different tools. A variety of some of the things that amateur radio operators perform includes assembly, fabrication, cutting and molding, mechanical, solar and wind, computers, plastic, soldering, metalwork, robotics, recording, welding. So these are all things that could lend themselves to your DIY or maker movement. Many hams in early days looked to magazines full of projects to build and experiments to be done. Not just radio and electronics, but a number of branches of science were featured, including chemistry and physics. And just to get an idea of what things were like back in 1925, you can click on this link and go back and read 11 issues of The Experimenter from 1925. And they're right here, and you could just go into them. They're PDFs, and they're very interesting to read through. And you might get some ideas for your own maker movement in your school using some retro type of things. One of the things that's very interesting about amateur radio operators is they tend to be lifelong learners to the extreme. I don't know very many other fields where I can sit down and teach an 80-year-old a new technology so they can learn how to use a new mode in amateur radio, and they jump right in. There's a lot of different things you can make. I have plans to build something called the $2 clothespin Morse code key that uses a clothespin, some thumbtacks, a battery, and a computer buzzer. Learning how to solder is always fun for a lot of the kids, even desoldering old junk equipment. I have a whole thing, some information on my website. Building simple electronic radio kits is very popular. And here's an example of some little kits you can pick up for sometimes even less than $1 on eBay. The battery may cost more than the kit itself, and you can pick up an inexpensive soldering iron and some solder and put together these little kits, and the kids really find it interesting because it's probably something they've never done before. Here's what the clothespin key looks like, and there's a link here with instructions on how to build it and how you can even modify it. So I hope I sparked your interest in radio. Here's my web pages, the Zach and Max comic books. Again, these are all links that you can get to by going to the presentation. I'll give you the slide show address here and again in a moment. Here's the information on Radio Day. And again, here's my contact information. Access to this slideshow is available at tiny.cc/RTICE. And actually, you're going to get access to the full slideshow, which has over 120 slides in it. The one I showed you today is a slimmed down version of that slideshow. So again, I hope you might find some interest in this. Please feel free to contact me at K8ZT@ARRL.net or at K8ZT73@gmail.com. And I'll put that into the information on the slideshow so that you can contact me. Hope you had fun with the Spark Conference, or if you're not at the Spark Conference, you know you can go back to the Spark Conference and watch a number of videos that were presented both live and pre-recorded. So thank you very much for listening today.